If you have something that you don't want anyone to know, maybe you shouldn't be doing it in the first place.
This statement from Google's former CEO perfectly captures how tech companies want us to think about privacy. But there's a reason Schmidt himself ordered Google to blacklist a news outlet for publishing his personal information, and why tech executives spend millions to shield their own lives from prying eyes. And this pattern repeats across every major platform. While they collect your data, they guard their own.
In Privacy Watch, Google has been fined $57 million for violating the European Union's new data privacy rules.
But what about when these invasive practices escape the walled gardens of big tech, when they actually infect the spaces that we least expect? This is VATSIM, the Virtual Air Traffic Simulation Network. It's the largest flight simulation community in the world. But beneath this seemingly innocent hobby lies something disturbingly familiar. Quote, VATSIM reserves the right in its discretion to require proof of real name and proof of age from an account holder. What you're looking at here isn't from a financial institution like a bank or a government agency or even a big tech giant. It's from a volunteer-run hobby group that demands government ID from its members, passports, driving licenses, or birth certificates. And here's the most troubling part. These documents are collected with no transparency about how they're stored, who has access to them, or when, if ever, they're deleted. For 7 years, Alex was a respected member of this community. Thousands of hours in virtual skies, and then one day this message appeared. And Alex isn't even alone either. Over the past 2 months, I've spoken to dozens of VATSIM members who have faced similar demands. Their stories reveal a pattern of arbitrary enforcement and a disturbing lack of accountability, a system where volunteer moderators with no security training are entrusted with thousands of government IDs. And as Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas once wrote, "The right to be let alone is indeed the beginning of all freedom." But in our digital world today, that freedom is being eroded, not just by the tech giants we've learned to distrust, but by the communities that we thought were safe havens. This is the dark side of VATSIM nobody talks about. So for those who don't know, what exactly is VATSIM?
VATSIM is the free international online network and community where flight simulator enthusiasts from all over the world can fly together and receive live air traffic control services from virtual air traffic controllers.
Airbus 115, runway 34 right, close takeoff, wind variable at 6.
The Virtual Air Traffic Simulation Network was founded on July the 12th, 2001, emerging after a dissolution of an earlier network called SATCO. The network itself is run by a board of governors who oversee 3 geographic regions. The first is Europe, the Middle East and Africa, the second is the Asia Pacific, and the third is Americas. Since partnering with Microsoft for Flight Simulator 2020's release, and with the latest 2024 simulator, VATSIM has grown to over 176,000 registered users worldwide. And according to VATSIM's just last year, they broke their own record with 3,208 unique connections during a single event. And over the years, VATSIM has become central to the flight simulation community, hosting massive events like Cross the Pond, a biannual event where pilots complete transatlantic flights between Europe and North America. So let me take you directly to the core document that shapes this entire situation, VATSIM's Code of Conduct. Under section A4A, highlighted right here, VATSIM states, during the registration process with VATSIM, you shall provide your real full name. Nicknames, call signs or abbreviations are not permitted to be associated with the account holder's registered account. But go a bit further and you'll find this statement. Quote, VATSIM reserves the right in its discretion to require proof of real name and proof of age from an account holder. This phrase right here, in its discretion, is where everything hinges. Now, requiring real names isn't exactly problematic. Many platforms do this. In fact, VATSIM does have some flexibility in how you connect. For example, you can use your first name or a shortened version. It's just during the registration itself where you have to use your full legal name. But this is where the problem starts. In their user agreement, VATSIM states, quote, providing false information on your account application is prohibited and is grounds for immediate termination without prior notice of your VATSIM account and network access privileges. But who exactly are these people making these demands, and what gives them the authority to do so? What makes VATSIM different from most online communities is its governance, how it's run. It's entirely volunteer-based, from the administrators to the controllers to the people making policy decisions. In January 2023, VATSIM was formalized as a non-profit organization called VATSIM Inc., but is still operated by volunteers. The network has a team of supervisors who help resolve issues between users, but also to enforce the code of conduct. Just think about that for a moment. The individuals who ask for your passport, your driving license, or your birth certificate aren't vetted security or privacy professionals, they're hobbyists with admin privileges. And it all comes back to that phrase we mentioned earlier, in its discretion. There are no published guidelines explaining when they might ask for this proof, no clear triggers, no transparency. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking, it's not always the supervisors making these requests. Maybe not. But because of that intentionally vague in its discretion wording, how can we know who is making the request and why? We'll get into that shortly. So after speaking with dozens of VATSIM members and ex-members, I've noticed some unofficial triggers that seem to have prompted these demands. The first is names that sound unusual to Western moderators. The second is logging in with a different IP address, like when you're traveling. The third is being reported by another member, speaking out against policies in forums, or just a random spot check. The problem is there's no official definitive list of triggers, it's all anecdotal. And this lack of transparency is even more worrying when you consider the sheer amount of personal data VATSIM collects. For example, in their data protection and handling policy from 2023, look here under section 5.2, they state they collect data such as, and I quote, the user's full name, their country of residence, their age but not their birthday, their history of connections to the network, the simulated air traffic control and/or pilot rating they obtained with the VATSIM network, positions of responsibility held within the network, including their level of access, and finally their history of any breaches of the VATSIM user agreement, code of regulations and/or code of conduct to which all users agree to be bound by upon joining. So that's a fair chunk of data that they collect. As I mentioned earlier, to understand what was really going on here, I began reaching out to other VATSIM users in the hope of really finding out who had experienced these verification demands. In total, I spoke with 24 different members from across Europe and North America. And the first thing that I noticed was that none of them really knew why they were being targeted. Michael, who had asked me to protect his identity, shared his experience. Quote, after 3 years on the network, I suddenly got an email saying that my account had been disabled. When I asked why, they just said that it was a routine check, but none of my friends have ever been asked. Then there's Adam's experience, again not his real name. After creating a VATSIM account and accessing it from 2 different locations while travelling within the UK, his account suddenly got suspended. VATSIM claims the different IP addresses indicated, quote, dual connections and possible duplicate accounts, a violation of their terms. But despite explaining his travel situation and providing his passport as requested, Adam was shocked to be suspended until 2025 for allegedly making duplicate accounts and lying to support, serious accusations he strongly denies. And these are just 2 examples. Then you can see the hundreds of comments, the forum threads, the direct messages, hundreds of them. Look at this, and this, and this. But the question that haunted every single member that I spoke to wasn't just why me, it was, is it actually secure? Who's actually got access to my ID after? When I started looking into what happens to the government IDs after users submit them, I expected to find detailed security protocols. You know, things like encrypted storage, strict access controls, audits, or clear data retention policies, the basics of responsible data handling. But that's not what I found, and that's a huge problem because these are sensitive documents containing birth dates, addresses, ID numbers, everything an identity thief would need. Instead, I found a disturbing lack of specifics in their data protection and handling policy. While they state a, quote, commitment to comply with both the law and good practice, section 5.1, and mention segmented security and standard SSL encryption in sections 7.2 and 7.3, there's no concrete explanation of how these sensitive documents are protected. They talk about access control and monitoring network activity, but what about the IDs themselves? Who has access? How long are they stored? Are they encrypted at rest? Appropriate security measures just isn't good enough when you're talking about passports and driving licenses, and that's all they have to say. And then I found this in section 8.4 of their data protection policy, quote, VATSIM data is retained indefinitely until removal is requested from a VATSIM user. So these scans of passports, driving licenses and birth certificates, they're just kept by a team of volunteers with no indication of how they're secured. And after digging into their policies, I was honestly left with more questions than answers. Then there's the question of why they're actually doing all of this. In section 10.1 of their data protection and handling policy, they claim they have a, quote, legitimate interest in collecting this data to allow the VATSIM staff to properly manage the network. So on the surface, these seem like reasonable concerns, granted. But for comparison, when companies like Microsoft or Google collect this type of sensitive data, they'll use things like enterprise-grade encryption, strict access controls, automatic deletion policies, and dedicated security teams, as well as data protection officers. And I know before you say it, these are extreme examples. We're essentially comparing apples with oranges, since we're talking about multi-billion-dollar companies versus a volunteer-run organization. But I'm bringing them up to illustrate the industry standards for handling this kind of sensitive data, and even sometimes they get it wrong.
Meta is facing the largest data protection fine ever issued under EU law.
This is the largest fine on the basis of the EU's General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR.
TikTok has been fined over the transfer of the personal data of European users to China.
Okay, so at its core, GDPR is built on 7 key principles, and at least 4 of them kind of apply to this specific scenario when it comes to VATSIM. Data minimization, purpose limitation, storage limitation, and security. So let's start with data minimization. This requires that personal data be, quote, adequate, relevant, and limited to what is necessary in relation to the purposes for which they are processed. Here's an email from July 2023 that one VATSIM member got from a supervisor telling the user that they can, quote, digitally erase non-pertinent information. I've also got another one from December 2022 where they say, quote, you may black out any information not relevant to confirming your name. So do you kind of notice the pattern here? In all of these cases, VATSIM places the burden on users to determine what information to redact, without actually specifying what's required versus what's excessive. They're essentially saying, give us everything and then you figure out what you need to hide. But that's not how data minimization works at all. Data minimization means collecting the minimum amount of data required to achieve your purpose, not collecting everything and then telling users to redact it themselves. But here's what makes the situation even more puzzling. Despite aiming for the same levels of realism, IVAO takes a different approach to user verification. While they also require real names during registration, IVAO only requests identification, quote, in case of doubt about the user's provided information. It's not a routine practice with unpredictable triggers. So we established data minimization. Now let's look at storage limitation, which is established in Article 5.1e of the GDPR. This requires that data be, quote, kept in a form which permits identification of data subjects for no longer than is necessary for the purposes for which the personal data are processed. As we mentioned earlier, VATSIM says that they retain data indefinitely unless removal is requested by the VATSIM user. So in theory, you could submit your passport in 2023 and the verification is completed. But according to this policy, that same passport remains on their system indefinitely, potentially for years or decades, even after the verification is completed. What's really odd about this is that even organizations with clear legitimate needs for identity verification don't keep these documents indefinitely. For example, NatWest, one of the UK's largest banks, has clearly defined retention periods for verification documents and securely disposes of them after a specific period ends. By contrast, IVAO's privacy policy states that, quote, after verification of the user's identity, a note will be made on the user's profile and the submitted information will be destroyed. They don't keep the documents indefinitely. And the third issue is VATSIM's lawful basis for processing this data under Article 6. For a legitimate interest to be valid under Article 6(1)(f), 3 conditions need to be met. These are, number 1, the interest must be legitimate. Number 2, the processing must be necessary for that interest. Number 3, the individual's rights don't override that interest. VATSIM claims legitimate interest as their lawful basis, stating they need this data to properly manage the network. In theory, and I'm just paraphrasing here, VATSIM's justification for requesting this data is to prevent banned users from returning, enhance the professionalism and accountability, and verify the age. While you could argue that these are legitimate purposes, the key question is collecting government ID really necessary to achieve these goals? For preventing banned users, there are much better ways to do this. For example, platforms like Steam, with over 132 million active users, use Valve's anti-cheat, which tracks and creates a unique digital footprint based on the user's computer components. This is far more effective. To enhance professionalism, platforms like Riot Games use a tiered sanction system, using warnings, social bans, and account bans for serious violations. In fact, a study conducted by the University of Zurich in 2016 found that during social media conflicts, an increase in aggressive comments could be observed on the part of non-anonymous users compared to anonymous users. Individuals who use their real names tend to propagate more hate compared to those employing a username. And as for age verification, companies such as YouTube, TikTok, or Instagram use less intrusive methods like credit card verification, phone verification, age gates, and even knowledge-based questions that will be difficult for younger users to know. Finally, let's look at the last principle, security, which is typically found in Article 32 of the GDPR. This requires, quote, appropriate technical and organizational measures to ensure the, quote, confidentiality, integrity, and availability of systems and services. Essentially, security that is proportionate to the risk. And with government IDs, that's pretty high risk. For sensitive documents like government IDs, you'd expect to see things like end-to-end encryption, strict access controls, multi-factor authentication, access logs, and a clear data breach notification procedure. For instance, Microsoft discloses to customers that data is stored in geographically specified regions, such as EU data centers, with encryption via AES 256 and TLS 1.2+ for data in transit. And on top of that, VATSIM policy also states, quote, there is no data protection officer within VATSIM as the organization does not regularly process data on a large scale due to the nature of the data that is collected and controlled and the circumstances in which it is collected. On a large scale. But we're talking about potentially hundreds, if not thousands of users, many of whom are being asked for government-issued IDs, and they're storing that data indefinitely. Doesn't that qualify as large-scale processing of highly sensitive data? Plus, we have to remember that VATSIM is entirely volunteer-run. Documents might be handed by volunteers across different countries using personal computers with varying levels of security. Computers that, as VATSIM themselves acknowledge, could be vulnerable to phishing or malware. Now, to be fair, other flight sim networks aren't perfect either. IVAO, for example, has had its fair share of security problems. They had severe issues, particularly in 2021, when they suffered a major security breach and a ransomware attack in 2022. When IVAO had this security problem, the risk was only email addresses or passwords. Annoying, yes. However, if that same attack happened to VATSIM, and their system was compromised, then data such as full legal names, addresses, and ID numbers would be all on the line. This is exactly why data minimization is so important in cybersecurity. The less data you collect and store, the less damage a breach does. Doesn't that scream for a data protection officer? And if better, less intrusive methods exist, why is VATSIM doubling down on these ID requirements? To understand that, we need to rewind back to see how VATSIM got here.
So when you connect to the network as a pilot, the expectation is that you are going to act like a real pilot. We do expect a certain level of competency from pilots when they're joining the network. It's not a place to join and fire up somewhere and just fire off and disrupt everyone around you, right? So
when VATSIM began in 2001, flight simulation was a niche hobby. This was a community that wanted realism, structure and accountability. It was never designed as a casual multiplayer. It was built for serious simmers where real-world procedures mattered. This statement here proves my point from a long-time member. The whole purpose of VATSIM is for serious flying. Less serious flyers who don't concern themselves about airspace rules will simply not be welcome. Or this statement here, if VATSIM becomes more like a game, it is no longer of any use at all. But everything changed with Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020. Soon YouTube was flooded with more and more videos showing millions of casual gamers what VATSIM was all about. But these new users weren't seeing the preparation that went into these flights, the endless charts, the procedures, the flight planning. They just saw something that was cool that they wanted to try. And this is where the culture clash begins. VATSIM suddenly found itself torn between two groups. On the one side, the diehards, users who see VATSIM as a serious professional environment. They want maximum realism and believe any compromise threatens what makes VATSIM special. And on the other side, the casuals, newer users who appreciate realism, but they just want to have some fun. Just look at what one controller writes on a Reddit thread. Flying a SID seems optional. Pilots use drone cameras to navigate taxiways because they don't know about charts. My problem is these guys who hold up everything, and when I ask them to disconnect, they simply reply with, "No, why? I'm already here." What's interesting is how this cultural divide directly manifests in VATSIM's approach to verification. These ID requirements really aren't about security, not if you think about it. They're about gatekeeping, about preserving what the diehards see as VATSIM's core identity. Despite VATSIM saying themselves that VATSIM is, quote, perfect for both new users and the long-time simmer, it is what you would call a cultural litmus test, much like the chemical indicator that changes color when exposed to certain substances. VATSIM's verification process reveals who truly belongs in their ecosystem. It is a deliberate barrier separating the casually interested from the genuinely committed. Those who complain about it become instantly visible as outsiders, while those who stay the course without protest demonstrate the exact temperament the community values. The problem is that this approach isn't actually separating the trolls and legitimate users who are just making honest mistakes. It's distinguishing between diehards willing to sacrifice privacy and casual users who rightfully question their demands. And this is where VATSIM faces its biggest challenge, beyond just ID verification. The Navigraph Flight Sim Community Survey from 2023 reveals that in just 1 year, the percentage of flight simmers using any ATC network plummeted from 64% to just 47%. Why the drop though? When asked, 35% of respondents said trolling, unhelpful behavior, inexperienced pilots as the main thing that they dislike about online ATC networks. In contrast, 23.4% said coverage and availability, and this trend is demonstrated in the subsequent 2024 survey. VATSIM's share, though, increased to roughly 88% of respondents. The issue is, though, they're only claiming a bigger slice of an already shrinking pie. And while VATSIM is busy trying to gatekeep their community with ID verification, a new competitor is rapidly gaining ground: AI-powered ATC. Products like Beyond ATC and Say Intentions promise something VATSIM can't: 24/7 coverage and consistent service regardless of time zone. No humans ruining your experience because of trolling. No worry about verification hoops. No sanctions because you needed to take a piss. Every verification email, every passport, birth certificate or driving license demand represents VATSIM making a choice that pushes more users towards these AI alternatives. Now, I do have to be clear that before concluding this investigation, I did what anyone else would do and reach out to VATSIM directly. I sent a detailed email outlining every concern that I've uncovered, giving them a full opportunity to explain their procedures and practices or dispute my findings. I questioned why they require government IDs, asked what happens to these sensitive documents after submission and how their indefinite data retention policy complies with GDPR requirements. I also requested clear answers about their justification and legal basis under GDPR, their security protocols, and their cross-border data transfer safeguards. However, unfortunately, as of this video's production and the time of me filming, VATSIM has provided no response whatsoever. But with that out of the way, I do have to be clear about something. I don't want to see VATSIM fail. This is a remarkable community that provides incredible value to flight simmers. I've spoken to so many users who have told me there's simply nothing else like it. I genuinely admire what they've built over 2 decades of volunteer effort. The tragedy is that this all seems unnecessary though. There are so many other technical solutions that could still maintain standards without compromising privacy or alienating newcomers. And unless they change course, unless they address these privacy concerns and recognize that the flight simulation world of 2025 isn't the same of 2003, they risk watching their relevance slowly fade away. And that would honestly be a tragedy for everyone who loves flight simulation. But here's why I spent months investigating this story. You deserve to know what you're signing up for. You deserve to make an informed decision about whether handing over your passport or your driving license to a network is worth it to you. What deeply concerns me is that VATSIM's new members include teenagers, kids as young as 13, being asked to upload government IDs to continue using a service they've already joined. And this isn't just about privacy policies or terms of service. This is about real people in our community, perhaps even you, whose personal data is at risk. If you've been affected by this, if you've been asked to provide ID verification by VATSIM, you have rights. The ICO, the UK's Information Commissioner's Office, needs to hear from you. Only through proper investigation can we ensure networks respect data protection laws. I've left all of the links in the description below, including a comprehensive Google Doc with every source, every policy document, and contact information for the ICO. This matters. Your privacy matters. And the more people who speak up, the harder it becomes to ignore. Thank you for watching this investigation, and please share this with anyone you know who uses VATSIM. They deserve to know too. And we'll see you in the next one.